Imagine standing at the edge of the sea with no way out and an army chasing you. What would you do? Today, we're diving into the incredible story of how God led the Israelites, parted the Red Sea, and proved his unstoppable power. It's a journey of faith and freedom. This is found in Exodus 7, verse 12. It's the story of how God showed his power and delivered his people, the Israelites, from slavery. Let's jump right in. So, here's the deal. The Israelites were slaves in Egypt for years. Like we're talking about 400 years of hard labor under Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. God sees their suffering and decides it's time to set them free. He sends Moses and Aaron to Pharaoh with a simple message: let my people go. But Pharaoh, nah. He's hard-hearted. He refuses to let the Israelites go. And that's when God steps in with the plagues. Moses strikes the Nile River with his staff, and boom, the water turns to blood. All the fish die and the water smells awful. Imagine trying to drink that. Pharaoh sees this, but he's like, nope, not letting them go. Next, God sends frogs. Not a few frogs, a lot of frogs. Frogs. In the beds, in the ovens, in the mixing bowls. Pharaoh's magicians could copy this one, but Pharaoh starts to crack. He asks Moses to pray for the frogs to go away. Moses does, and the frogs die. But Pharaoh changes his mind and says, nope, you're staying. God sends gnats next. These tiny bugs swarm everywhere. Pharaoh's magicians try to copy it, but they fail. Even they admit this is the finger of God. But Pharaoh still refuses to let the people go. Now God sends flies. Swarms of flies are everywhere, except in Goshen, where the Israelites live. God's making it clear, I'm protecting my people. Pharaoh starts bargaining. Okay, maybe you can go sacrifice to your God, but stay in Egypt. Moses is like, nope, we gotta go. Pharaoh agrees, but then he changes his mind again. The fifth plague hits Egypt's livestock: horses, donkeys, camels, sheep, cows, all dead. But again, nothing happens to the Israelites' animals. Pharaoh, still stubborn. Now God sends boils, painful sores, on the Egyptians and their animals. Imagine everyone scratching and in pain. Pharaoh's magicians, they can't even stand before Moses because they're covered in boils. But Pharaoh still refuses to let the people go. Next comes hail, massive chunks of ice falling from the sky. It destroys crops, animals, and anyone caught outside. But again, Goshen is safe. Pharaoh admits, I've sinned, pray to God for me. Moses prays, and the hail stops, but Pharaoh hardens his heart again. Then God sends locusts, millions of them. They eat every plant left after the hail. Pharaoh's officials even beg him to let the Israelites go, but he still won't. Now it's dark. Not regular nighttime dark, but thick darkness for 3 days. People can't even move because they can't see. But in Goshen, the Israelites have light. Pharaoh finally says, fine, go, but leave your animals. Moses says, nope, we're taking everything. Pharaoh flips and tells Moses to get out of his sight. Finally, God sends the 10th plague, the most devastating. Every firstborn in Egypt dies, from Pharaoh's son to the poorest servant's child. But God tells the Israelites to sacrifice a lamb and put its blood on their doorposts. This is where the first Passover happens. When the angel of death sees the blood, it passes over their homes and they're safe. Pharaoh finally gives in after this. Pharaoh can't take it anymore. He calls Moses and says, go, take your people and leave. The Israelites pack up and leave Egypt that very night. Why this story matters. This isn't just about some old plagues in Egypt. This story shows us who God is. God is powerful. He controls nature, animals, and even life and death. God keeps his promises. He promised to deliver his people, and he did. God protects his people. Even in the middle of chaos, he shielded the Israelites. 2 other verses to think about: Psalm 105, verses 36 to 37. he struck down all the firstborn in their land, the first fruits of all their strength. Then he brought out Israel with silver and gold, and there was none among his tribes who stumbled. Hebrews 11 verse 28. By faith he kept the Passover and sprinkled the blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them. The 10 plagues remind us that God is in control, even when things seem impossible. Pharaoh thought he was the most powerful person around, but God showed him who's really in charge. And just like God delivered the Israelites, he's still delivering people today. All right, we have talked about the 10 plagues and how God showed his power to Pharaoh and the Egyptians. After the last plague, the death of the firstborn, Pharaoh finally let the Israelites go. But that wasn't the end of the story. Let's talk about what happened next when God led his people out of Egypt. So after the death of the firstborn, Pharaoh couldn't take it anymore. He called Moses and Aaron in the middle of the night and said, "Take your people and go worship your God. Leave Egypt right now." The Israelites didn't waste any time. They packed up their stuff, took their flocks, and even asked the Egyptians for gold, silver, and clothes, just like God told them to. And you know what? The Egyptians gave them everything. They just wanted them gone. That night, about 600,000 men left Egypt, not counting women and kids. It was a huge crowd, and they all walked out, free for the first time in generations. Now here's where it gets really cool. God didn't just set them free and leave them on their own. He stayed with them. During the day, he led them with a pillar of cloud, and at night, it was a pillar of fire. Imagine that, God literally guiding you every step of the way. And there's something important here. God didn't take them on the fastest route to the promised land. Instead, he took them through the wilderness, near the Red Sea. Why? Because he knew they weren't ready for battle yet. If they saw war too soon, they might get scared and want to go back to Egypt. But guess what? Pharaoh had second thoughts. After the Israelites left, Pharaoh and his officials were like, "Wait a minute, what did we just do? We let all our slaves go." So Pharaoh gets his army together, 600 of his best chariots, plus a bunch of other soldiers, and chases after the Israelites. Imagine how terrifying that must have been for the Israelites. They're out there in the wilderness, no weapons, no army, and now the most powerful army in the world is coming after them. When the Israelites saw Pharaoh and his army coming, they freaked out. They started complaining to Moses, "Why did you bring us out here to die? We were better off as slaves in Egypt." But Moses, he stayed calm and said, "Don't be afraid. Stand firm and see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again." God tells Moses to raise his staff and stretch it over the Red Sea. And when he does, boom, the sea splits in two. There's a dry path right through the middle, with walls of water on both sides. The Israelites start walking through, and Pharaoh's army follows. But once the Israelites are safe on the other side, God tells Moses to stretch out his staff again. The waters crash back together, and Pharaoh's army is completely wiped out. Not one of them survives.